The piano arrived 6 weeks before the piano teacher did, a wedding gift from a man in Cheyenne none of us had ever met, addressed to a woman who'd never played a note in her life. It took 2 freight wagons and 4 men to get it up the porch steps. It sat in my front room like a locked door with no key, and for 6 weeks the whole town had theories about who had sent it and why. Then the piano teacher arrived to tune it and give the lessons the gift apparently required, and I recognized him before he finished introducing himself. We had grown up on the same road in Ohio. I hadn't seen him in 11 years. He hadn't sent the piano, but he knew exactly who had and why, and it took him considerably longer to tell me than it should have. My name is Josephine Hartwell. I have lived on the Hartwell Ranch outside of Laramie, Wyoming, since 1878. When I married Daniel Hartwell and came west from Ohio to a life I had chosen deliberately, with a clear-eyed understanding of what it would require. Daniel was a decent man, steady and hard-working, and we had built 4 good years together before a spring flood took him while he was clearing debris from a blocked irrigation channel in 1882, a stretch of ground that had flooded every spring for a decade without incident, until the one spring it didn't spare him. I had been a widow for 4 months when the piano arrived. Daniel's death had been sudden in the way frontier deaths often are. Not sudden in the sense of unexpected danger, since the channel had needed clearing every spring and everyone understood the general risks of working near moving water, but sudden in the sense that a Tuesday morning had been entirely ordinary right up until it wasn't. I had spent those first 4 months doing the practical work of grief, settling accounts, deciding what to keep and what the ranch could no longer support without Daniel's labor, learning which of our hired hands could be trusted to manage tasks I hadn't previously needed to oversee directly. I had not spent much of those 4 months thinking about joy, or about what might eventually replace the particular hollowness of a house built for 2 people that now held only 1. The freight company's manifest listed the sender as C. Whitfield, Cheyenne, and beyond that offered no explanation. I did not know a C. Whitfield. Daniel had done business with a great many men in the course of running the ranch, and a man capable of purchasing and shipping a piano at considerable cost across difficult terrain was not a name I would have expected to have escaped my notice entirely. The piano itself was a fine one, a proper upright, dark mahogany case, ivory keys unmarked by use, clearly new. It arrived with a note, brief and formal. For Mrs. Hartwell, with the hope that this brings some measure of joy in difficult circumstances. A piano teacher will follow within the month to assist with tuning and instruction. C. Whitfield. I sat with this note for a long time. I did not know how to interpret a gift of this magnitude from a stranger, arriving 4 months into my widowhood, with an explanation that explained nothing beyond its own existence. The town of Laramie predictably developed theories at a rate that outpaced any actual information. Some assumed a secret business debt Daniel had been owed, now settled by a scrupulous partner. Some assumed something less honorable. I did not know which theory, if either, held any truth, and I found the piano's silent presence in my front room to be less a gift than an unanswered question I had to look at every day. The piano teacher arrived on schedule, 6 weeks after the instrument itself, on a Thursday afternoon in late June. I heard the wagon and went to the door expecting a stranger, and found instead a face I had known since I was 7 years old. Thomas Ashford had grown up 2 farms down from my family's place in Ohio. We had attended the same one-room schoolhouse, fished the same creek, and developed an easy friendship that had, by the time we were both approaching adulthood, begun to feel like something that might become more, though neither of us had ever said so directly. I remembered him at 17, playing an old upright piano at the county fair, with a talent that made grown men stop their conversations to listen, and I remembered thinking, in the private way you think things at 17 that you don't examine too closely, that I would very much like to keep listening to him play for a considerable portion of my life. He had left for conservatory training in Cincinnati when he was 20, pursuing that talent with the specific seriousness of someone who understands they have been given something rare and owes it proper cultivation. I had married Daniel 2 years later and moved to Wyoming, and we had exchanged perhaps 3 letters in the 11 years since, each one further apart than the last, until the correspondence had simply stopped without either of us deciding to end it. He stood on my porch with his satchel of tuning tools, and for a moment neither of us said anything, because 11 years is a considerable span to compress into a doorway greeting. He said, finally, "Josephine." I said, "Thomas Ashford, in Wyoming." He said, "I could say the same to you." I invited him in. We stood in front of the piano together, this instrument that had been sitting in my front room for 6 weeks as a question I couldn't answer, and I said, "You're the piano teacher." He said, "I am." I said, "Did you know it was coming to me, specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. The quiet told me something before he said anything. He said, "I knew." I said, "Then you know who sent it?" He said, "I do." I said, "Thomas." He said, "Charles Whitfield was Daniel's business partner in the cattle contracts. You may not have known him by name. Daniel handled that side of the operation privately, from what I understand." I said, "That tells me who. It doesn't tell me why." Thomas set down his satchel. He looked at the piano rather than at me, which I noted, because a man who has nothing to hide generally doesn't need to find something else to look at while he explains himself. He said, "I think that's a longer conversation than a doorway allows." I made coffee. We sat in my front room, the piano between us like a third party to the conversation, and Thomas told me what he knew. Charles Whitfield had been more than a business partner to Daniel. In the 2 years before Daniel's death, the two men had built a genuine friendship. Whitfield had visited the ranch twice, though I had been away both times on family matters in Ohio, which explained why I had never met him despite his apparent closeness to my husband. Daniel had spoken to Whitfield, in the months before his death, about a worry that had apparently occupied him more than he'd shared with me directly. A concern that if anything happened to him, I would be alone in Wyoming with no family nearby. Daniel had asked Whitfield a favor, not knowing the favor would be needed so soon. He had asked that if anything happened to him, Whitfield look after my situation in whatever way seemed appropriate, without being obtrusive, without making me feel managed or pitied. I said, and Whitfield decided a piano was the appropriate way to do that. Thomas said, "Whitfield knew you'd grown up with music in the house. Daniel had mentioned it, that your family had a piano in Ohio, that you'd wanted lessons as a girl and never gotten them because the money went to more practical things. Whitfield thought a piano and lessons might give you something entirely yours, not tied to the ranch, not tied to grief, just yours." I sat with this. I said, "How did he know to send you specifically?" I watched Thomas's face when I asked it, because I had known him since childhood and I still remembered the particular stillness that meant he was choosing his words with unusual care. He said, "I've been teaching piano and tuning instruments across the territory for 3 years, since conservatory training didn't lead where I expected it to." Whitfield had heard of me through mutual business contacts in Cheyenne, and when he decided on the piano, he made inquiries about a teacher. My name came up. I said, "That's a considerable coincidence." He said, "It's not entirely a coincidence." I waited. He said, "When Whitfield's inquiries reached me and I heard the gift was intended for a Mrs. Josephine Hartwell of Laramie, I recognized your name immediately. I could have declined the position. I did not decline." I said, "Why not?" He looked at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down. He said, "Because it had been 11 years and I had spent a fair amount of that time wondering what had become of you, and this seemed like an opportunity that wasn't going to present itself twice." The front room was very quiet. Outside, the Wyoming afternoon was doing what June afternoons do, warm and bright, entirely unconcerned with what was happening inside my house. I said, "You took a job to see me again." He said, "I took a job that happened to require seeing you again, and I did not examine my willingness to accept it as closely as I might have if I'd wanted to talk myself out of it." I found this admission considerably more honest than I had expected. I said, "Thomas, you've been in my front room for over an hour, and you're only now telling me the actual reason you're here." He said, "I was working up to it. The piano's story needed telling first. Yours and mine seemed like it required more preparation." He almost smiled, the first real smile since he'd arrived. He said, "Old habits. I've spent 11 years being careful about things I wanted, in case wanting them too openly meant losing them faster. I understood this because I had spent 4 months of widowhood learning a similar caution about my own wanting. I said, "I'd like the piano lessons." He said, "I assumed that was included in the arrangement." I said, "I'd also like to hear how the rest of the 11 years went. Not the summary, the actual account." He stayed in Laramie for the 3 weeks the tuning and initial instruction required, which was longer than strictly necessary but which neither of us questioned aloud. He taught me scales and simple pieces in the mornings, and in the afternoons we talked about Ohio, about the 11 years, about Daniel, whom Thomas asked about with genuine interest rather than the careful avoidance most people managed, about conservatory training that hadn't led where he expected, and the teaching and tuning work across the territory that had become its own kind of life. I learned, over those afternoons, that Thomas had left conservatory training after 2 years, not for lack of talent, but for lack of the particular temperament that formal performance seemed to require. He found he did not enjoy playing for audiences who expected precision above feeling, and had discovered instead that he preferred the intimacy of teaching, of watching someone else's hands find their way toward music for the first time. He had come west in 1879, initially for the adventure of it, and had found the frontier towns considerably more receptive to a traveling music teacher than he'd anticipated. People who had left behind pianos and violins and the cultural comforts of the East were often desperate for someone who could help them keep those threads connected to what they'd left. I told him about the ranch, about Daniel's steadiness and his particular way of making difficult decisions look simple, about the 4 years that had been good ones despite their ordinariness, or perhaps because of it. I found that talking about Daniel with Thomas did not feel like betrayal or performance, the way it sometimes did with townspeople who wanted either comfort or gossip from my grief. It felt like simply telling an old friend about a chapter of my life he had missed. By the second week, I could play a simple hymn tune with only occasional errors. By the third week, Thomas told me the formal instruction period was concluded and that any further teaching would need to be arranged as an ongoing matter rather than a single commissioned visit. I said, "Are you offering to stay?" He said, "I'm asking whether you'd like me to." I looked at the piano, this instrument that had arrived as an unanswered question and had become, over 3 weeks, something considerably more specific. I thought about Charles Whitfield, a man I had still never met, who had understood something about grief and about gifts that don't announce their full purpose immediately. I said, "I'd like you to stay in Laramie. Whether that means teaching or something else, I think we should work out together rather than me deciding it for both of us in a doorway conversation." He said, "That seems like a reasonable approach." Thomas Ashford settled in Laramie that autumn, building a modest but steady practice teaching music and tuning instruments across the territory. We were married the following spring, a full year after Daniel's death, in a ceremony that honored both what had come before and what was beginning. Charles Whitfield attended the wedding. I met him for the first time that day, a quiet, careful man in his 50s who shook my hand and said only that Daniel had asked him to look after my happiness and that he hoped the piano had, in whatever roundabout way it managed, accomplished that. I told him it had accomplished considerably more than he'd probably anticipated. He said that was, in his experience, how the best gifts generally worked. You gave what you could see was needed and let it find its own way to becoming something larger than you'd planned. The piano still sits in what is now our front room, considerably more used than it was in its first 6 weeks of silent mystery. I play in the evenings, still imperfectly, while Thomas corrects my fingering with the patient affection of a man who has been waiting 11 years for the opportunity. Some gifts arrive complete, some arrive as the first note of something that takes months to finish composing. That was the whole of it, that was everything.